We are diving straight into a true watershed moment in geopolitics today. I'm your pro-African insider on this explainer, here to talk about unlocking the continent's massive domestic power.
And I'm your seasoned development finance pro, bringing the global market perspective on how we actually structure and leverage that power.
You know, for decades, the dominant global narrative painted Africa as this continent in perpetual need of a Western rescue mission. But at the recent G7 summit in Evian, France, that entire charity case narrative was completely shattered.
Kenyan President William Ruto looked the leaders of the world's wealthiest nations in the eye and delivered an absolute knockout punch. He said, "We are not a charity case. We are a $4 trillion investment partner." It was such a necessary shock to the system. He essentially demanded that global markets stop looking at Africa through the lens of poverty management. It's a massive industrial powerhouse.
Exactly.
But look, a great speech doesn't automatically pour concrete, right? The real question we have to answer is, how does the continent actually operationalize this $4 trillion potential?
And that brings us to the core debate of today's explainer. I am firmly planting my flag in the internal agency camp. It's time to rely on African domestic frameworks, unify our trade, and mobilize our own trapped capital. No more waiting for external validation. Okay, but I'm going to argue for global integration. You can't just isolate yourself in today's economy. Africa has to pragmatically reform international financial systems, leverage foreign de-risking mechanisms, and build infrastructure at a true global scale. So, what's the move? Do we wait for global finance to fix its broken rules, or aggressively build our own? Let's get into it.
Let's kick things off with part 1, unlocking Africa's trapped wealth. Right, before we can even talk about unlocking wealth, we have to talk about what's draining it. In development finance, there's this thing we call the Africa premium. Think of it as an invisible geopolitical tax. Mechanically, an African nation with identical or even better economic fundamentals than a country in Eastern Europe or Latin America is routinely charged way higher borrowing costs.
Which is inherently unfair. Global markets are pricing the entire continent based on outdated biases and just geographical proximity to isolated crises. They're completely ignoring the current economic realities on the ground. This premium suffocates growth and essentially forces nations into taking on really expensive foreign debt.
But here is the ultimate mic drop for you. $455 billion. That is a staggering amount of domestic capital currently locked away in African pension funds alone. Just sitting there, the continent isn't broke. Add in the non-bank financial sector, and you're looking at over $1.6 trillion. So why on earth are African governments flying to London or New York to beg for expensive money?
Well, it's because that local money is trapped behind regulatory walls. Stringent mandates force these pension funds into low-yield government securities. Plus, you've got fragmented capital markets, which means a fund in one country literally can't invest in a power plant right next door. The solution isn't more foreign debt, it's tearing down these internal barriers. Just look at Kenya's new 5 trillion shilling National Infrastructure Fund. It's designed specifically to crowd in trapped local pension funds and private equity, entirely without foreign strings attached.
Okay, that's a beautiful ideal, but domestic capital alone just isn't going to bridge the massive infrastructure gap we have right now. You absolutely need international structuring. Have you seen asset recycling? It's basically an elegant cheat code for infrastructure. You let the public sector take the initial construction risk to build the thing. Once it matures and actually generates revenue, you de-risk it and distribute the operational rights to private global investors for a huge upfront cash injection. The Africa 50 Group did exactly this with the Senegambia Bridge. They freed up $100 million in immediate cash for Senegal and the Gambia without taking on a single cent of new expensive foreign debt.
Which naturally leads us into part 2, the critical minerals race.
This right here is a profound paradox. Africa holds 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves. We're talking the cobalt, the lithium, the copper, the literal building blocks essential for the global green transition. Yet, the continent remains trapped in this colonial-era model, just digging up raw dirt and loading it onto ships, while the truly transformative wealth, the refining and the battery manufacturing, happens everywhere else.
We absolutely cannot wait around for the world to play fair anymore. Back in 2009, the AU adopted the African mining vision to mandate local processing. But honestly, decades later, it's just moving too slow. So individual nations are fiercely exercising their own agency today. Zambia is strictly enforcing 20 to 40% local procurement quotas. The Democratic Republic of Congo, they're demanding 10% equity in new projects. Uganda is banking on local value addition to expand its economy tenfold by 2040. They are legally forcing multinationals to build local ecosystems.
Right, but let's inject a dose of pragmatic reality here. You can pass all the mandates you want, but you still need partners with capital to actually build those refineries.
Look at the stark visual contrast happening on the ground right now. The G7 approach is currently defined by, polite diplomatic statements of intent and really cautious feasibility studies. Meanwhile, Chinese state-owned firms are physically out there pouring concrete, building processing facilities, and laying heavy rail today. Africa shouldn't isolate itself. It should actively leverage this immediate geopolitical competition. Pit the global powers against each other to secure tangible infrastructure right now.
Okay, let's pivot to part 3, reforming the debt labyrinth.
Because all of this incredible industrial ambition hits a total brick wall if we don't address the fiscal black hole that is sovereign debt. $90 billion. That is the projected debt repayment for sub-Saharan Africa in the year 2026 alone. Think about that. Capital that should be building those refineries and rail lines is instead evaporating from the continent just to service historical loans. At least 1/3 of the economies in the region are teetering on the edge of debt distress, which is exactly why functioning global frameworks are so desperately needed.
Except the current global framework is mechanically broken. When a country defaults, they get dragged into the G20 Common Framework, which is incredibly sluggish. Zambia's restructuring took over 3 years of complete economic paralysis. And worse, it totally ignores massive internal liabilities. Ghana had to restructure 203 billion cedis in local debt completely outside this international framework, almost collapsing its own local banks in the process. This is exactly why we need an internal African debt observatory. We need to standardize our own data, create our own early warning systems, and present a unified internal approach before a crisis even hits.
I hear you, but you can't just walk away from the global table when things get tough. Global frameworks are evolving, and multilateral coordination actually does work. Just look at Ethiopia. They recently secured a landmark $2.5 billion debt service relief agreement. And get this, the creditor committee was co-chaired by both France, a traditional Paris Club member, and China. Despite all the deep geopolitical tensions out there, rival creditors successfully collaborated. Pragmatism gets results.
That transitions us perfectly into part 4, seats at the global table.
Because this is where we hit the ultimate representation paradox. At that watershed Evian summit we started with, President Ruto gave a masterful speech, but he was literally the only African leader sitting at the table. How can one temporary ad hoc invitation adequately represent a continent of 1.4 billion people, comprising 54 sovereign nations? Decisions affecting the economies of the entire energy transition are consistently made in rooms where Africa is structurally locked out.
But the doors to those rooms are finally opening. In 2023, the African Union permanently joined the G20. That is a massive, pragmatic, institutional win. And in 2025, South Africa is hosting the G20 summit on African soil for the very first time. That is real power.
No, it's polite inclusion, not real power. True parity means holding the pen when the rules are actually drafted. If we look back at the 2005 Ezewini Consensus, the demand was crystal clear: full, permanent UN Security Council seats with veto power. Without the structural power to actually veto global mandates, a seat at the G20 is just a really nice photo op.
Ultimately, undeniable power comes from connecting the puzzle pieces of the continent through the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA. If Africa integrates its 54 fragmented economies, removes cross-border tariffs, and builds regional value chains where, say, one country mines the lithium, the next refines it, and a third manufactures the battery, it shifts entirely away from external reliance. That is how you build true leverage.
Let's bring it all together in part 5, the ultimate paradigm shift.
There's a quote here that really nails it. The era of accepting unmet commitments as a substitute for policy must end.
I completely 100% agree with that sentiment. Like we said earlier, speeches don't pour concrete. Summit communiques don't suddenly lower borrowing costs for a new water treatment plant. Whether you believe in internal agency like my co-host or global integration like me, the only true metric of success is implementation.
Exactly. The empirical data over the next 3 to 5 years will be the ultimate test for both of our theories. Will those trapped pension funds actually be unlocked? Will local processing plants actually rise? Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to chew on. If the global system remains sluggish, will the legacy of the Evian Summit be the catalyst that finally frustrates Africa enough to turn its gaze entirely inward? Will Africa wait for a permanent seat at the G7's table in a decade? Or will it mobilize its own $4 trillion, integrate its own markets, and simply build a better table of its own, where the rest of the world has to politely ask for an invitation? Thanks for joining us on this explainer. We'll see you next time.
keep asking the big questions.